So here's the next installment of the podcast. And Ken and Sarah, I'm very happy you guys came on. And really, for dozens of episodes now, I've been trying to find the right angle to bring general contractor, construction manager, or management side of the industry on the podcast with a relevant topic. And really, the group here is very focused on quality control. So I think it'll be helpful before we start. I'll let either of you decide who goes first, just to give a little bit of context around your background and a little bit of the focus specifically on enclosures.
Sarah, go ahead.
All right. So I'm Sarah Krawiec. I've been with Consigli for about 4 years. And before working with Consigli, I was a building envelope consultant working for an architecture firm. And then before that, once again, I was on the GC side. So I came over to Consigli. They're a client of mine. I really wanted to be boots on the ground, focusing on the quality of install. And that's ultimately what I do now. I am a quality control manager. So I support multiple projects, really focusing on how to install high performing buildings and the kind of quality check-ins throughout the entire process, all the way from pre-con to the punch list and closeout.
Awesome. And I'm Ken Amano, and I came to Consigli about 12 years ago, and I came over to the dark side, I guess, so to speak, from an architecture firm. So I have a design background as well, and I was at one firm for 13 years in Boston. So.
And when you came, was it specifically to focus on quality control?
It was. I came to know about Consigli just because I actually was on a CA project for about 2.5 years in construction with Consigli. So I was the project architect during construction, and it was a project for the city of Cambridge. It was a pretty interesting project. It was a double skin curtain wall, library edition, right outside Harvard Square for the main branch, and it was also attached to a historic restoration of existing library, and we also put an underground parking garage, which essentially became a huge green roof for restoring the park. So it was a massive project, probably the biggest that Consigli had done at the time. It was 149, which in Massachusetts is hard bid. So we had this double skin German curtain wall system that was hard bid, low bid. But I essentially got requested by the city to camp out with Consigli in the job trailer for 2 years. So I had a slightly unorthodox construction administration experience, but that's how I got to know Consigli. And then a number of years after the project, not immediately afterward, we kept in touch. And I like being outside more than behind a desk all the time. So they kind of say, been looking to get someone into quality, but we're not really sure what that means. But we think you would help. Are you interested? So it was kind of an organic process.
And is the quality focused across the building or specifically on the skin?
It's across the building. So, Sarah and I both, I think, come from more of a enclosure heavy background, but we also get pulled into things like flooring and, any number of other issues relating to construction and design. So, it's always a great learning experience, but I'd say, probably the majority of our time's more focused on enclosures.
Something I've picked up on is that a lot of the larger general contractors have now taken the path of having enclosure specific superintendents or project managers just because of the risk or liability of the scope and or the size or scale of it. So have you noticed that's because Consigli really is a very major player, especially in the Northeast, but the growth path was very quickly accelerated. And I'm sure, Ken, you've experienced that in the past 12 years. So kind of from day one, has there been that delineation to focus on it, or have you noticed that more so coming up in the industry in the past few years?
I mean, I don't think we've had the luxury of being able to specialize to that degree. I think naturally, once you have, say, a unitized curtain wall system, right? You have a superintendent that led a project that you utilize that, then typically we try to interview for the next one. But we don't necessarily have supers that special. In general, we try to do a lot of cross training. So if there's a project that's doing a unitized curtain wall, and we have other projects that are in, say, pre-construction, a lot of times if that project team is again looking to understand lessons learned and then get some real experience, then we have peer reviews on site. They come out and take a look at everything. So I think there's a lot of training that way. But
Sarah, you said that you really go, Sarah. Sorry.
I also think it's focused on not necessarily a facade component, but the type of building, right? For instance, schools, typically superintendents, project managers are familiar with that type of building. And same thing with hospitals, right? Because those are kind of different animals and they have their own unique quirks and processes by the building type. So to kind of answer, I don't know if it's specific to facade, but more correlated that way.
You said that you like being in the field, and understandably, but do you see equal significance, impact, importance as to focusing on the quality early on, pre-CA phase, as to actually witnessing the implementation, making sure all your details are coordinated, making sure that production is up to quality par before everything arrives on the job site? Because how many times have we been in a situation where we're sitting there at the roof transition and everybody's looking around saying, how do we deal with this?
Right. No, I have noticed like a trend, at least from my experience, is that we are now shifting the conversation to earlier on in the process, right? Especially with the Boston area, we have a lot of building like requirements or these certifications like LEED, Passive House, and those types of buildings is actually a different way that we construct in the field. For example, we need to get early buy-in on the AVB and what types of facade testing. Are we going to do a blower door test? How are we commissioning this building in order to meet that criteria? So to your point, we are having a lot of conversations early on. In the pre-con phase, we're having constructability reviews. We're also seeing more design assist contracts, specifically with facades, as we are, planning for all these innovative facade types. Boston tends to be a leader, at least in my experience, although I'm biased. And kind of paving the way. So how do we plan for that learning curve of something new and really implementing the innovation that we are coming up with in our industry here? So having those conversations earlier on, bringing in the consultants, getting their feedback, way before we even start construction. And another way that we do that is through mock-ups. I've seen a big kind of boom, like mock-up mania. There's a lot of value in return on investment with mock-ups, but to also support your point, it's that part does require early coordination, because you're kind of doing if it's a standalone for a facade, it's a couple stories high, you have to have procurement earlier, you have to have design, and that allows the team to kind of figure out the bugs in the system and also to validate the performance. For example, if I was working on a project where we had a mock-up and on the curtain wall was a fin attached through outriggers. And in the mock-up process, we realized that we were about 1/16 off to where we couldn't get the fin off, right? So that was a really good lesson learned, tweak the design a little bit, but it's a lot more beneficial to figure those items out in the mock-up rather than on your building.
So two things I want to bring up that you just mentioned, mock-ups and then design assist. So is it typically you guys selling design assist to the owner, or is it the owner saying, okay, we want to onboard somebody early, pick who you want for design assist?
It's usually driven, it's usually a mutual, I think, decision, right, in the end, but a lot of this is driven by schedule, honestly. Design assist is usually required, like unitized curtain wall. The whole point of going unitized is to be able to get the facade on as quickly as possible. But that also means that you have to have it designed, and then it's in fabrication while the structure goes up, right? So everything's kind of much more, everything gets moved forward, essentially. So it's usually, and then we have to release much earlier. So that means that we have to have buy-in from the design team well before CDs are done, which is why we have this partnership, design assist, where maybe at the end of DD, we start talking, and then everything's essentially design's kind of calibrated towards, the partner involved in their systems, right? And then there's a lot of structural coordination relating to that too, especially with, changes in the code. So that's another key aspect of it. The structure gets, fast tracked. There's usually an early design package that gets pushed out for that. All this has to get essentially accelerated. So that's the main benefit of design assist. But we still have projects that go all the way through CDs and they're bid out traditionally. It's just it's usually driven by schedule.
I'm going to ask a hard one. So because you've seen it from both sides, how would you, being in the CM position, if you were to put yourself in the subcontractor's shoes, wrapping your head around the idea of you might go through this extensive design assist period and then the project's just going to get hard bid at the end of it? What would you recommend a subcontractor communicate to the team, or how could they better handle that to avoid that situation?
I mean, we go through a fairly rigorous bidding process and vetting process for design assist. It's probably even more rigorous than if we were just bidding this out plans and specs at the end. Because again, you're basing this off of relatively incomplete information, right? There's a base of design, there's a design intent kind of outlined in some renderings and some other stuff, but you're really trying to kind of form the right partnerships so that in the end the project's successful. So we do choosing by advantages. It's not just about numbers, right? I mean, price obviously has a huge part of this, but in the end, I think most of the, I guess, sophisticated subcontractors and trade partners that we would do design assist with are now completely geared toward that, especially in the Boston market. Most of our major partners won't do anything but design assist anymore, just because they know that there are too many pitfalls if they're just trying to trying to bid on something that may or may not fit them, right? In the end, right? The design's fully baked, and then you find out later that you have all these structural coordination issues that no one anticipated, and then double design obviously is a tricky thing in terms of liability and taking on that responsibility. But design assist essentially becomes delegated design anyway, regardless. So at least gives you a head start. It's just like the mock-up that the mock-up process that Sarah was talking about. The mock-ups are great. They're especially great in telling you what's not going to work, right? Not just what does work, right? So, but it's a free pass because then you fix it and then it doesn't necessarily, derail, hopefully, the critical path schedule and everything else. So it's the same kind of process.
When it comes to mock-ups, and maybe it's like design assist on a certain caliber of job, do you feel like you have to sell the owner on it, or is it and get early buy-in, or has it become the norm? Like, can you remember a time maybe a few years back where it was a sticking point? They say, no, we don't want to pay for it, or we don't want to, delay the schedule, and now it's just business as usual?
It depends on the location to some degree, but Boston and Cambridge and a number of other kind of nearby cities and towns have all adopted what was Boston's model. The Boston Redevelopment Authority essentially required a civic design review, and mock-ups were a major component of that. So designers in Boston are used to having to essentially show what the design is at full scale. And, I think over the years, these mock-ups have, gone from like a one-story, maybe 15 feet wide by 10 feet high type of, mock-up to now where some of them were almost, $750,000. They're 2.5 stories high. And they have to show, any number of different conditions, especially at street level. So they become much more extensive, and therefore I think the expectation is also risen in terms of what you need to do. And developers understand that too. They know that in order to get the zoning relief that they're trying to achieve, right, and to make their projects profitable, they need to have buy-in from these civic design commissions.
And so do you get a lot of pushback with, I know Boston as a sort of community and building landscape is very sensitive to the existing infrastructure. Particularly, I'm thinking about like an area in the Seaport where you have a lot of new construction. Is there a lot of local committees or zoning boards pushing back on these new high-rise buildings that might, call it, interrupt or change the feel of the landscape?
Yeah, there's always a public review process, and the public is involved with those at the meetings. So neighbors are usually very wary of anything that's very tall or is going to, obviously cause traffic, other impacts, but they are actually very interested in design as well. So, I think in order to get these things done, there's an understanding that you have to go through this process, whether or not it's just for individual buildings, or a lot of times, especially for universities and colleges, they have to submit a master plan zoning design essentially. And so they're proposing that they're going to build 5 buildings in the next 10 years, and then they have to actually get the public to approve all of that. So Sarah's currently on a fairly large project over near Harvard, but across the river from Cambridge that was all kind of part of that kind of master plan process, the ERC project. Right, Sarah?
Yep. It's about 4 buildings in one campus and adjacent to another general contractor building another building. And so we kind of taken over this square footage between 2 separate teams among Consigli, at least all connected by a green space. So that project itself will kind of dramatically change the landscape near Harvard.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk about or dig into how you guys, what's becoming normal to you, mock-ups, design assist, sort of vetting the whole process throughout, and then how you mend with communicating these things to other offices and how their practices might be very different based on either market conditions or their local codes. So what is it that really, do you think, drove such strict, not only sort of implementation, but enforcement of these codes in Boston?
I think it was like a confluence of a bunch of different factors, right? But Article 37 was a City of Boston, Boston Redevelopment Authority requirement that came out, I think, around 2007. And then the state adopted a stretch energy code, which was, I think, one of the first in the nation. That was around 2008. But the Article 37 essentially also stated that any like I think large building, which was like 50,000 square feet in Boston, actually had to be LEED certified, and that was, I think, kind of the starting point for really focusing on sustainability, right? And then needing to kind of incorporate a lot of these. Now, again, they didn't need to be formally LEED certified. They, I think, had to be LEED certifiable, right? But you had to provide the documentation for that. But I
Right.
think between that and then coming out of the Great Recession around the same time, um, there was a huge sustained building boom in Boston. And that was also partly due to the fact that, the whole city kind of what was transformed by the Big Dig, which also kind of finished around 2006, right? So all of a sudden we had, like you mentioned, the Seaport, Adrian, like that whole area was parking lots, for the longest time, and all of a sudden the Big Dig was finished, and then that became a huge new development corridor, and not just that, but like Ink Block and a whole bunch of other neighborhoods. So the Greenway was a huge thing naturally, so downtown was transformed, but I think there was a huge new building boom that then kind of transformed the formerly fairly, I think conservative or traditional brick focused architecture to, looking at glass and a lot of other different facade materials. And I think that's part of the reason why there's been a sensitivity to that, but also a focus on that. So, I mean, design firms in Boston, a number of the big ones have their own building technology, um, departments or, people that focus on that kind of thing now. So it's not just the envelope consultants, of which
Have
we
you
have of
found
many. Yeah.
have you found Boston architects either because of some of this unique architecture starting to work elsewhere, or vice versa, New York and other architects doing more work in Boston? In like
You
that
mean,
big, I think the big passive house project, right downtown. I don't want to call it Millennium Tower. It's the all glass one, right by like High Street area. I think that was Handel. Which I think actually I take that back. I think they have a small Boston office. But I'm just wondering with some of the more unique architecture, and a lot of new construction, if you're seeing a lot of outside architects being attracted into the market.
I think there's some of that. I think, I mean, for the most part, I think the Boston architecture community, tends to know that because it's so there's so many like Sarah mentioned, like there are a lot of different codes that we have kind of specific to us. It's probably a harder market to kind of get into if you're a New York firm,
Yeah.
or elsewhere. And then I think a lot of the Boston architects had to go international, especially during the Great Recession. To other places like like China or the Middle East, right? And I think they cut their teeth and got a lot more exposure to kind of more advanced, facade systems than we had traditionally looked at. We didn't do a lot of glass in Boston before that. And I think after the recession, they brought that experience back. So I think that's partly to do with it as well.
Well, it's kind of like the firm you were at, William Ron. I see them on this sort of unique abstract university work all over the country. So I guess once you get known for something and attention on it, it kind of starts spreading. But one thing that you said that was
Right.
really interesting was that they were going for the building had to be LEED certifiable, not necessarily LEED certified. So do you see that now with Passive House, where it's not that Passive House is required per code, but they need to reach that Passive House level? So what does that look like in terms of owners wanting to or not wanting to buy into it?
Well, I can't necessarily speak to owners wanting to buy into it or not, but I do say that once that decision has been made, right, there is a ripple effect in what follows in order for us to plan for it. So we are seeing more, passive house standards being used. For example, like the blower door test and a greater emphasis on building commissioning and testing the assembly as a whole, right? So it may not be passive house certified, but we are still using those means and methods to have high performance buildings. Does that answer part of your question?
Yeah, I mean, really what I want to expand on too, and I don't know if there's a clear answer. Understanding, is there like okay, we pay 5% more, we can get the certification. Is there a sense of like around rough costs? And if you're already designing to sort of that level, if another 2% just gets you the certification, if it's really just at that point getting everybody to officially buy in.
Hmm.
I mean, I think our estimating department did do a case study with their sustainability director, like even 2 years ago about this. I think the response back was that it's anywhere between like 2 and 4.5%. But I mean, the challenge with trying to, to create this kind of broad brush, if you just do this, you'll pass kind of thing, is that, everything continues to change. So, at the time when we were starting to look at that, mass timber wasn't exactly as big as it is now in the Boston area that it wasn't like say 2.5 years ago. So that changes things in terms of how you seal envelopes, for instance. Deflection criteria for curtain walls is different with mass timber. So, and I mean, Sarah's on one right now. So I think there's always this learning curve that you're always trying to catch up with, which is great because I think everyone's trying to innovate, right? And I think,
Right.
especially with something like mass timber, um, it's a visual thing that the public understands, right? And I think, like you mentioned, Adrian, we have a lot of universities and colleges here that want to show that they are being responsible, and through the architecture of mass timber, for instance, that's one of the ways to do it, right? So, but because of that, I think it's hard to put a number to it. Like we have a lot of projects that are in construction that don't have to meet the new energy code that went into effect last July, in Massachusetts, where passive house actually might be the easier compliance path out of the three than some of the other ones because it's more straightforward. So I think everyone's trying to understand what the new rules are, honestly, and it's not just the owners, it's even the envelope consultants that specialize in this. Like it's kind of a brand new world in terms of trying to understand what it really means, especially with renovations. And we do a lot of new construction
true.
naturally, but renovations are its own thing, and the new code actually doesn't really take into account how best to deal with that. So
That's I'm looking at every renovate. That's predominantly what we do in Boston. And every renovation project, it seems like either the delegated designer or design professional seems to have a little bit of a different way how they interpret the code. And it's difficult. It's kind of like our, bird-friendly glazing or local on 97 in New York.
oh, yeah.
So much of it is up for interpretation. And I understand it's trending us in the right direction, but it causes, I don't want to say a lot of conflict and probably chaos, but it's like everybody wants to keep their hands clean of it.
Yeah, I think there's been, a change in the culture around quality. More so for me, kind of switching from the design side, I was aware of it, and now I'm experiencing it on the construction side. And what that looks like is early buy-in, right? Like this is something that we all want to do. It could potentially cost more time, more energy, effort, right? But is it necessarily more? Sometimes no, because we're going to have that conversation anyways. We're just having it at a different phase. So it kind of changes our approach and changes our schedule a little bit and how we do things. But ultimately, and I kind of bring up this mock-up again, because not only is that a mock-up or first install of the building, but it also really sets the attitude around quality with your team members and having all of these people involved, and also sharing, the ownership of it, because they are part of the process and they're given the opportunity to say, hey, this is an area of improvement, or what about this, right? And it creates that cohesive kind of team dynamic of like, okay, this is a standard we're trying to meet. How do we get there? And it's not just one party is going to take all of it. And throughout construction, it's like, okay, we have all these discussions that are about 2 to 3 years before we even start installing the facade. So how do we translate or pick up that information to the boots on the ground and the labor installing them? So I think it's really important as we kind of go through this design assist and mock-ups that really sets the tone. And I don't want to say you're the oddball out if you don't get in, but you are noticed for not playing nice in the sand, and how your specific team can contribute to the overall goal.
So you guys cover quality control for all of Consigli.
Yes.
Yes.
So you have to have some takeaway or experience when you go deal in DC or you go deal in New York, and it's, here the bad cops are coming in, and how, I guess, it's received in other markets, and, what is and is not prioritized.
Yeah, no, that's a good point as far as the different, I'll say, outlook and quality culture, right? I will admit that I'm biased to the Massachusetts area because that's where I stay most of the time. But kind of slightly visiting some other projects, or what I hear from my other colleagues, is the mock-up conversation isn't as like well received, or I mean like communal buy-in, right? Like some of the other projects we have in Massachusetts, and we mentioned ERC and Treehouse, where everyone is honing in and being like, how can we set expectations early and get this done? Where I'd say there's maybe a little bit of a lag because it's not as focused on in that geographical like industry. Not to say that they're not doing it, but in Boston we have the BSA, we have the Boston Building Enclosure Council, even like this podcast, kind of creating this community and constant awareness that perhaps isn't as strong in those different regions.
I think passive house for a long time was like this buzzword, and now it's very relevant. And the one thing that you said that I know gets very kind of controversial feedback on is mass timber. So did you bring that up because you're seeing more interest in the market, or actually see potential implementation in the near future?
No, we definitely have a lot more interest in the market. I mean, Sarah,
You're right.
the treehouse project, kind of, because of the name, obviously it looks like a treehouse. It is mass timber, including wood on the exterior, which in Boston's climate can be a risk, but we'll see what happens with that. That's a studio gang project, but we're getting to the point where I think we have like 6 or 7 ongoing projects that are incorporating mass timber.
Wow.
Some in pre-con, some already installing, and as you know, Adrian, we have our own kind of self-perform, I guess, arm of Consigli, where we have our own carpenters, we have our own laborers, masons, and I think 2 projects we have our own carpenters actually installing the mass timber. So it's something that we're very much kind of in the middle of, and obviously, our own self-interest, we want to make sure we get right. So a lot of these lessons learned that I think Sarah was talking about, whether or not they're mock-ups or not, we're finding that in the last 5 years we're needing to accelerate this. It used to be that we had the traditional kind of CMGC post-mortem of a project, right? We figure out what we could have done better, what was good, right, and then we try to pay it forward to other projects. But I mean, we're getting to a point now, I think, with technology that we need to kind of understand what the lesson learned is now, and then literally get into our pre-construction projects so that we buy it outright if we didn't, the first time, kind of thing, right? We can't wait for the year or year and a half to kind of really understand what the impact was. So there's a lot more, I guess, cross-regional conversation. Maine was a huge kind of, I think, at the forefront of mass timber, and actually our PX up there, who's the director of the office, Matt Tennell, was heavily into mass timber like 8-10 years ago, right? So he had a lot of experience in trying to push mass timber, and finally it's kind of catching up, where he kind of helped a lot of our Massachusetts projects and elsewhere in understanding what the risks were, right? So
what are some like of the conversations that are being had or lessons learned on the 6 or 7 projects, or maybe like some objections you get either from, I don't know, owners or architects? Like, I understand it's a lightweight material. I know some other topics are fire suppression, and like cost aside, what are some of the design and quality and execution items that keep coming up?
I think to name a few, or the biggest one is protection. And that is, how do we protect mass timber throughout install, right? This is a natural product. It naturally absorbs water, and it is going to be exposed to the elements. And specifically at Treehouse, where we have sub-beams that are exposed from the interior compared to other projects where perhaps it's 100% concealed, but there's still a structural integrity that we need to protect. And what that looks like is different based on the region, the types of weather that you have. Right now, we're having quality summits talking about the different products that we've used on this project compared to that project, what worked, what didn't. And as Ken mentioned, having that live feedback of something that happened a couple months ago on one project, now we're communicating that to another project that's in pre-con, and then another team that, okay, we're installing it now, let's look out for this component, especially moisture wicking. And with related to that, kind of going further up the stream, is how are these beams or CLT being transported to site, and what is going on in the manufacturing side of things? What's their QA/QC process? So that's also been looped into the conversation of what one manufacturer is doing compared to the other, and if one's working better, then can we make that suggestion? So that type of feedback is going up like different chains and ultimately making its way into pre-con to be part of that conversation.
And then I mean, talking facades and I guess roof, it's just a lot of the things that you take for granted with, let's say having concrete slabs, right? No longer really apply. I mean, there are a lot of topping slabs naturally in conjunction with mass timber projects and CLT, but how you connect back to structure is fairly different, right? And you have to kind of new rules that you have to kind of figure out. Something as simple as fire stopping along the perimeter gets a lot more complicated, right? Where the rating is and everything else. And again, so I think that's part of the learning curve that we're all trying to. Design assist helps with that naturally, but I think
Yep.
You have to go through the reps, and then sometimes each jurisdiction having authority, the building inspector may have a different view on all this. That was what was really pulling mass timber back for the longest time. It's just that no one really understood the code ramifications until the code got updated fairly recently, right? So I think we're all still playing catch up, right? With both on the design side and construction side, I think. But
So there's, I mean, just to think about like, okay, we're trending in this direction and we'll see more and more in the Boston area, but what is it that would get it into other markets? So if you already have projects that are implementing it, it's probably been years sort of in the making or part of the discussion. So would you say this wasn't necessarily recent stretch energy code driven? It was more like this either true sustainable or perceived sustainability around the material. So that's really what drove the direction.
Yeah, that's what I
And
think.
I would think it's probably like institutionally driven as well, like the type of clientele you're working with.
Right. I've noticed, specifically in the Boston area, the types of projects that I work on are either universities or big corporations, as Ken mentioned, to show like their promise towards sustainability and using those products, or I should say building materials. So I think, the type of client, they are more involved, at least from the projects that I'm, working on. They are part of those conversations all the way down to means and methods and protection. Right? We're all equally kind of invested in this new material, but also trying to get ahead of the learning curve that comes with it. And although it's, not new, it's been implemented across, the United States in different regions. They're also dramatically different, climates. Like if you're going to build mass timber in Arizona compared to Massachusetts for the humidity, you're going to take different precautions. So there's talk about it, especially at conferences. So I think that really kind of kickstarted the awareness of using this new building material. So I don't think it really correlates to the energy code because we've been seeing it elsewhere. Also, some of the 7 projects that we are working on are not just in Massachusetts or in Maine. They're kind of in our surrounding states as well. So we kind of see that integration, but I think that comes from a drive of, architects and design kind of exploring this new way of construction and this new material in a way that we haven't necessarily thought about, 10 or 15 years ago.
It's interesting because in some aspects, Boston is highly conservative, but then in other aspects, really pushing the envelope and trying to innovate. And so implementing mass timber on a commercial project, there's risk and the unknown factor. But then on the other side, if you think about like advancements in glazing technology, something like VIG, vacuum glazing, or even dynamic glass, there's probably a lot of pushback because it's like, I don't know, where else have I seen it? What's the durability? What's the inherent risk? So I don't know. Have you guys seen anything or worked with either of those two or have any opinions?
Let's see. Well, I'm just diving deep into the curtain wall for the treehouse project now. So I haven't, I'll have to get back to you on that, on my opinion on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've seen with VIG, it's such a wonderful potential solution for the historic replacement realm, a lightweight material that will get superior, U factor values, especially within existing infrastructure that might have limitations. But there's like this inherent, okay, I want to go next door and see who else has done it. Or, well, we can just kind of stick with the triple glazed unit or what we're comfortable with, and we're not yet there. So the construction industry as a whole is, I mean, like the Stone Age at times in terms of advancing. So you guys probably, compared to other offices, get to see the more innovative side of things.
Yeah, I don't think we've actually had a project that went forward with the vacuum glass. I don't know if it's just that the envelope consultants up here or the design firms are not necessarily completely bought in. Have you seen that more prevalent in New York City, or it's on the tippy point, but I don't know who's going to kind of step up and be the guinea pig to some degree, right?
Well, that's the thing. It's like the first person does it, and then it's just a mover, and you get traction. But who's going to bite first?
Yeah, I think not necessarily speaking to those components, but we'll just use like mass timber or low carbon concrete because I'm more familiar with that. And you brought up a good point, kind of like no one wants to be the guinea pig. And in construction, we are very slow to take on innovation because there is a safety component and a promise to the Commonwealth, right? That is just a higher level of risk. So we have to do like a deep analysis of what works, what doesn't. And so that's why I think it's kind of hard for new means and methods and materials to infiltrate our market because they do have to have a strong background for us to even consider it. We're all peeking over each other's fence of like, oh, who done it where, even different parts of the country. And so to kind of get ahead of that learning curve, I really think it has a strong emphasis on the workflow and kind of checks and balances or like checkpoints. For example, I'm going to keep mentioning mock-ups because it's just like mock-up mania of, okay, now here's our trial error. And kind of going back to, mass timber, we did mock-ups of all the different scratches, dents, any of the typical damages we might see. So that way we can get ahead of that knowing it's going to happen. So there is going to be a learning curve, but how can we plan for it, right? Giving ourselves time, resources, training, and like communication across departments, which is kind of also why we push for design assist or early coordination and early buyout, because that reduces our risk with these multiple checkpoints, allowing us to pivot if it's not meeting our design intent. So I think that kind of protects all parties involved as going through that process, which is iterative, right? Sometimes there is trial and error. I know that working with mass timber, we have really tight tolerances in how we connect these beams. So putting together a mock-up of how we're actually going to fit that connection, and if we need to change the design, is really valuable compared to, you know, other members that we're familiar with working with, and giving yourself that time to learn how to improve.
It's very interesting that, sort of as an outsider, not really as an outsider, like Boston as a market as a whole, really, I always talk about like staying true to a basis of design and suppliers and subcontractors that you're comfortable with. I mean, after COVID, I've said this on many episodes, you can't believe the infiltration of new contractors, new suppliers from all over the world coming into the market. And so much of it has been more cost driven than design sort of limitation driven. And I think it's because we don't have, our codes are not as stringent. And there's a little bit more of a fly by night, we'll take on the risk and figure it out mentality in some other markets. And I don't know, it's sort of like this thing in Boston that like you kind of want to harness and not let go of and not lose that sort of trait, because I think it makes it unique to the rest of the country.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the spec writers or not, but like, the base of design is a very, very strong thing in Boston, and architects are very wary to kind of veer from that. Sometimes just because I think there was, unfortunately, so much of the institutional design knowledge got lost after the Great Recession. A lot of the senior associates who had really understood the products right and were more CA oriented had retired. But I think there's a reluctance to kind of veer off a path to some degree, partly because like there are always unintended consequences to that, right? Like we all know that designers typically try to design towards something that it's more aligning expectations. They want the end product to look like the rendering, right? And they're going to base the rendering off of some product that they've either used before or they have a lot of experience with because, a rep or someone has been helping them all through the way, right? And then when you change, even if it's an equal, any equal is going to be a little bit different, right? Because, each manufacturer has their strong points and what they want to bring to the table. So no one likes to go through that relearning process where, you thought that you had a certain detail at a corner and all of a sudden you don't have that anymore because the manufacturer, I think that's where, a lot of the design firms in Boston don't like that. That's in like a gotcha moment, but like it's just, I assumed that I was going to get X, and then they, especially with all the design commissions, where it's not just the architects, but they've essentially presented to a city or a donor, right, for institutional clients. It has to be a 1-for-1 match, right? And I think that's driving a lot of this, but it's also a good thing. I mean, it makes all of our jobs, I think, a little bit more challenging, but it's not so, I guess, open-ended as to what you get in the end, right? So
it's nice. All right, I really enjoyed speaking with both you guys. I think it's wonderful, the BSA and other means of sort of maintaining the community. Is there anything else that you guys are involved with or want to mention, just in terms of Consigli and organizations and just sort of spreading this knowledge in the Boston area?
Yeah, so I think the Boston Building Enclosure Council is a really good organization to kind of at least check out. You can find it on the BSA website. They have monthly meetings that focus, similar to your podcast, Adrian, about upcoming topics, changes, and challenges in the design. That's also how I learned about mass timber, like about 4 years ago. So it's really valuable resource to be part of. And then also the BSA in general has multiple different organizations. Another one is like the Carbon Leadership Forum, where we talk about low carbon concrete and how that's going to soon be implemented in the driving force in the Massachusetts sector. So that's another thing to look out for on the horizon.
Good. All right. Thank you both for coming on. It was a good time.
Thanks for having us.
great. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.